Hi, in this lecture you will see how to find the triggers and manage them with the alter and drop statements. Let's start with exploring the triggers. To check or find the triggers, we can either check them by using the SQL Developer search tool or we can check them from the data dictionary views. I will not show you the SQL Developer way now, you know that already. Now, we have two different data dictionary views for that. User objects and user triggers. You know user objects data dictionary view already. In here, we can check whether it is valid or not. Or we can check the create dates, last modified dates, etc. You know that already. The second one is user triggers data dictionary view. In here, you can find the type, event, base table name, status, create code, etc. of the triggers. This view has a lot of information about the triggers. Now, let's open up the SQL Developer and see what is there in this view. Let's simply select all the columns from user triggers. As you can see, the first column is the trigger name. You use this column to search for a specific trigger. The second one is the type of that trigger. It is before statement or after row, etc. The next one is the triggering event. Then the table owner comes. It has the owner of the base table in your trigger, not the owner of the trigger. The owner of the base table. Do not confuse about that. Then it has the base object type, whether it is a table or a view. Then it has the name of the base table or view. And then the column names if the trigger has the update of column list. If not, this area will be null. Then the aliases for the new and old qualifiers. And then the when clause. As you can see, we have one here. And then the status of the trigger. Notice that the status in user objects view and here are different. An object can be valid or invalid. If an object is invalid, it cannot be executed. If a trigger is invalid, it may cause some errors. For example, if a trigger is invalid, when you try to make an insert to your base table, the trigger will be recompiled automatically. If it cannot succeed, it will return you an error. So you will not be able to make your insert. So to work normally, the trigger must be valid. But this column does not have the valid or invalid status. As you know, it is stored in the user objects view. However, we may want to make our trigger useless for some time. If we make it invalid, we have some problems. But if we make it disabled, it won't work and won't make any problems. So a trigger can also have enabled or disabled status. Do not confuse about that. If a trigger is valid and enabled, it will work fine. If it is valid and disabled, your updates, etc. on the tables or views will work, but your trigger will not be fired. If your trigger is invalid, you will have an error. Great. The next column is a description of that trigger. This description is created by the database server itself. It shows us the necessary info about the trigger like the timing, event type, base table, etc. Then we see the action type column. Here we see all PL/SQL, but there can be something like procedure too. Up to now, we made our examples on PL/SQL code blocks with the triggers. But we can call a procedure within the body of our trigger. You will see how to use that. If we use the procedure with the call command in a trigger, you will see procedure here. Then you see the trigger body column. Here you see what writes in the body of the trigger. There are some other columns. You can check them later, but not so important for now. Alright, we can explore our triggers by using the data dictionary views like that easily. The next subject that I want to mention is managing the triggers. As we create our triggers, we can now enable, disable, compile, or drop our triggers by using both SQL Developer and with SQL statements. I will not show you how to do that with the SQL Developer. when you right-click on the trigger name in the Connections tab, you will see all these options. Just click on the correct option and click OK. To enable or disable a trigger, you write alter trigger commands. Then the trigger name you want to alter, and then write enable or disable command. You can also enable or disable all the triggers on a specific table or view. This is sometimes really useful when you want to copy the data from the main tables to the test tables, because the triggers may cause some integrity problems sometimes. So you disable all the triggers, then copy the data, then enable them all. To do that, you write alter table, table name, and disable all triggers or enable all triggers keywords. With this way, you disable or enable all the triggers of a table or view in one step. Or sometimes you may want to compile the trigger manually. To do that, you write alter trigger name and compile keywords. Actually, if your trigger is invalid and needs a compile, it is automatically compiled by the server on the first usage. But if you want to compile manually to see if it will be validated or not, you can use this command. Because if your trigger is not validated, it will prevent the data manipulation on that table or view. To remove a trigger, you write drop trigger and the trigger name. Of course, to do all these, you need to have the right privileges. No need to make examples for all, but let's open up the SQL developer and enable, then disable all the triggers in employees copy table. I simply write alter table employees copy, enable all triggers. Now let's run it. Alright, now let's test it from the triggers branch in the Connections tab. Let's simply right click here and click refresh. As you can see, all of the triggers created from the employees copy table are enabled. So now let's disable them then. I simply write disable here and run it. And check from the Connections tab. As you can see, all of them are disabled in one step. These enabled ones are not created on the employees copy table. Great. Now you can test the other commands by yourself. Alright, in this lecture you learned how to find some info about the triggers. Then you have learned how to enable, disable, compile and drop the triggers. So this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next lectures.